Well, I'm sure glad I'm not a Puritan preacher charged with telling you how lowly and miserable you are and how happy you would be if you could only get to that ball. It's much nicer to tell you that you're okay the way you are, that you're loved, that you belong to this family as well as the family of God. Mystical experiences are, well, quite amazing and life-changing, but they're not the only way into the spiritual side of life. In spite of the fact that our denomination was formed by the Cynthias of the religious world, while the Cinderellas went elsewhere, we honor those direct experiences of mystery and wonder which come to some people in all faiths. Maybe as you sang "Over the River and Through the Woods," you pictured those New England churches founded as parish churches by the Puritan settlers of New England, tall steeples, white clapboards, burying grounds in the back, plain glass windows because, as you may remember, the Puritans had developed a big allergy to religious art, highfalutin liturgy, and other things they considered to be the excesses of the English church. No stained glass windows for them. The Puritans buried in those graveyards would be bemused to discover that their churches, most of them, had passed into none other than Unitarian hands. Those Christmas card churches, and they are beautiful, although they're hard to heat, are the backbone churches of our no longer exclusively Christian denomination. I realize this is a little hard for those of you who came to Unitarian Universalism out here in the frontier to fathom, but it's true. Not only are the tall steeples in New England mostly Unitarian steeples, but those steeples are really close together. If this was Boston, there'd be a UU church downtown, there'd be one out here, there'd be one in Tijeras, one in Los Ranchos, one in Placitas. Of course, there is already a UU church in Rio Rancho, but if Rio Rancho were in New England, there might be two there. In New England, the Unitarians ruled the roost for most of a century, from the late 1700s through the end of the Civil War. Even in New England, the Unitarians don't look much like the grimly earnest founders of the country anymore. And although Unitarianism is religiously more conservative in New England than it is in the rest of the nation, it still bears only minor resemblance to the religion of the Puritans. So what happened? The answer lies in the flow of time, of course, but also in the very structure and practice of the Puritan faith. For although in some ways modern Unitarian Universalism has moved far from its roots, in other ways we are faithful children of our founders. You no doubt learned in school that Puritanism was embraced by those who wished to purify the practices of the Church of England. This movement was largely fueled by lay people who read their Bible for themselves and judged the practices of the English Church in its light. They found these practices wanting, as there is little in the Bible that resembles the pomp of any sort of high church or the complexity of doctrine or dogma which the Christian church had developed over the centuries. So already, before even a Protestant foot was set in New England, we have several of the characteristics of today's Unitarian Universalism. Individuals taking for themselves the right to discern religious truth, a high value placed on reasoned interpretation of Scripture, and a general preference for simplicity. It's no accident that we don't have any stained glass windows in our church. You may remember that the English Puritans had 2 degrees of ardor in their purifying task. A separatist group left the church altogether, and a more moderate group stayed to try and reform it from within. The separatists eventually were forced to leave England for the more moderate and tolerant religious climate of Holland, from whence some of them came to the New World. Those were the Pilgrims who did the whole Thanksgiving bit. Later, many of the moderates also migrated, becoming the settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and other New England colonies. Although the other religious groups came to the New World, notably Anglicans, Catholics, and Jews, as well as Baptists, Quakers, and other sects, and a few homegrown ones like the Universalists, it is estimated that at the time of the American Revolution, about 75% of Americans were either affected by or involved in the Puritan mindset. Although we remember these two groups by their purifying bent, it's important to notice that their ultimate goal was to revive the church. Indeed, the major mark of the Puritans is their conviction that serious matters should be attended to seriously, and religion first and foremost. These people cared ardently about their religious life. From their diaries and letters, we see that they are almost constantly involved in self-reflection and self-examination and a sort of spiritual training that's been compared to athletic discipline. They had their duties to their Creator and to their fellow creatures, and they were involved in a personal quest to do right throughout their lives. It's this quality of determination that we think of when we think of the Puritans. In the course of the 18th century, New England Puritan tradition broke into two streams, the evangelical and the rationalistic. The evangelicals developed a revival wave called the Great Awakening, a time when itinerant preachers held great meetings and sought to recapture that immediate sense of the Holy Spirit, which they thought was the conversion of souls. Their basic story of salvation is that Cinderella story that we heard. We're all miserable, lowly, enslaved creatures, but if we're lucky, good, and bold, we can go to the ball, and the prince might there just fall in love with us and save us. 20,000 people gathered for the largest of these rallies, an incredible crowd for that day. This revival, the Great Awakening, had the same society-wide impact that the rise of the new religious right had on our society about 40 years ago. But even more importantly, it had an impact on the religious life of the colonies, causing major rifts in churches which had long been stable. The rationalists, who believed in the gradual and orderly process of conversion, more like that Cynthia story, were dismayed at the emotionalism of the converts, and they disapproved of the whole thing. The rationalists, intellectual heirs to the Enlightenment, believed in the capacity of human beings to know and understand the divine and the divine will. They also believed that human beings had enough good in them to do the divine will, if encouraged and properly educated. These were the two theological differences that split the Puritan faith into the tracts which became the liberal and the orthodox. The old Puritans saw God first and foremost as a judge who loved righteousness and condemned sinners, whereas the liberal Christians, as they preferred to call themselves in those days, saw God as a loving parent who had a benevolent concern for all of humanity. The Orthodox believed that human nature was in itself depraved, corrupted by Adam's sin, whereas the liberals saw humans as having the capacity for righteousness and love as well as sin, and insisted that it was our good or ill deeds that determined our fate after death, not simply the capricious grace of God. The Puritans were Trinitarians when they became that sophisticated theologically, whereas the liberals rejected the doctrine of the Trinity as unscriptural and irrational. These two groups, believe it or not, coexisted together in the parish churches, the tax-supported parish churches of New England, people of both faiths worshiping side by side in those same churches for longer than one might expect possible. But that harmony was finally strained to the breaking point. By 1805, battle lines had been drawn. The congregation of each of the parish churches that those old Puritans had built had to, peacefully or in desperate struggle, more often the latter, decide for itself which religious faction would reign. Many of the battles over who had the right to vote and who got the property when a split was inevitable had to be fought in court. Most of the judges were of the Liberal Party, so it was charged that the Liberals did a little too well in the settlements. In the fray which engulfed the whole society of Boston and its environs, the media began to call the Liberals Unitarians, and we've been stuck with the name ever since. But in all other ways, the Liberals were victorious. In 1825, the American Unitarian Association was set up, and it included at its core nearly 3/4 of the parish churches in the towns around Boston, as well as a sprinkling of groups from Maine to Maryland. The remaining Puritan churches began to call themselves Congregational churches, and that denomination, now called the United Church of Christ, also exists to this day. The Universalist in our name, by the way, comes from another liberal denomination which merged with us in the 1960s. That's another story. And UUs and the UCCs, the United Church of Christ, are now the best of religious friends and have even produced curriculum together, since now we're both on the liberal side. So how do we relate religiously to the Puritans? In the first place, we inherited from the Pilgrims the preference for covenant rather than creed as the mechanism of church membership. The Puritans didn't have creeds. It's not that they were so tolerant, it was that they were so sure that God would see to it that orthodoxy would prevail, and they saw no need to help the process along with creeds. To become a member of the Puritan Church, you had to testify to your born-again experience, your experience with the Prince, and sign a covenant, like the kinds of covenants that we use in our order of service each week. This one is still used in the First Parish of Salem, Massachusetts, and it's the one from which today's affirmation is derived. The original goes like this. This goes all the way back to the Pilgrims. We covenant with the Lord and with one another, and do bind ourselves in the presence of God to walk together in all his ways, according as he is pleased to reveal himself unto us in his blessed word of truth. Pretty general, really. Gives a lot of room for interpretation. And where these covenants were left alone, men and women could walk together in spite of very different theological opinions amongst themselves and different from their parents. Thus were the seeds of tolerance and diversity, the major hallmark of our denomination today, sown almost by an accident of arrogance, but allowed to flourish and grow into the denomination that we now know. The second thing we share with the Puritans is a fierce love of congregational polity. In our system of church government, each church governs its own affairs. The Puritans, owing largely to their bad experiences in Europe with more centralized forms of church government, valued congregational autonomy as the cornerstone of religious freedom. Each Puritan and later each Unitarian Universalist congregation, therefore, selects its own traditions and forms of worship, hires, supports, and if necessary, dismisses its own minister, and in general, manages its own affairs. Our denomination, the UUA, is a voluntary association of congregations supported by contributions from those congregations, just as each local church is supported by the contributions of its members. This is the cornerstone of our religious liberty. Along with the autonomy of congregations, of course, we believe in the religious authority of individuals. This, too, we owe to the Puritans, who as Calvinists claimed the priesthood of all believers. A good thing, too, since they didn't have any ministers in their churches for several generations. But that didn't matter to them, because they believed that they could access God directly without professional intermediary, and they were content for a while to appoint a lay elder to preside over worship and lay teachers to read the lessons. It's not too far from a priesthood of all believers to the Unitarian Universalist belief in the religious authority of every individual. After all, if we don't need a priest to bring us nearer to the divine, we also don't need a priest or a church to tell us what to believe about that divinity. And just as in Puritan times, many of our congregations didn't have ordained ministers serving them, but rotated jobs of presenting and arranging worship and teaching among interested members, so many of our Unitarian Universalist congregations still do the same. Here in Albuquerque, that was the way of doing things for our first 7 years, from 1949 to 1956. And the Albuquerque Fellowship and groups in small towns like Farmington and Durango still do the same thing. Finally, the Puritans, as you remember, owed their existence to those Englishmen who sat in their studies and read their Bibles and came to the conclusion that the Anglican Church was not being faithful to its precepts. Thus, they had all along valued education, individual thought, and the use of reason in religion. It's no accident that the ideals of the Enlightenment caught on in New England rather than, say, Maryland, a Catholic state, or in South Carolina, where a self-satisfied Anglicanism reigned. The Puritans were particularly susceptible to the age of reason. An educated clergy was important to them, and as soon as they could, they set out to establish Harvard College. Harvard Divinity School is now a non-denominational school of religion, concentrating on the education of scholars rather than on the preparation of ministers. And it's notable that most denominations discourage aspiring ministers from studying there, lest they become too embroiled in academics and neglect the practical and spiritual subjects. Unitarian Universalists, however, still valuing, above all, an educated clergy who give thoughtful and scholarly sermons, have no such prejudice against Harvard. Many of our ministers, including Angela, still prepare there. We owe much to our Puritan parents. There are several ways we differ markedly, most notably in that they were staunch Christians, whereas we are mostly not Christians. Another difference is that they felt strongly that society's religious institutions should be government-supported. You may be surprised, having heard that the Pilgrims came to this new world in search of religious freedom. But they did just that. They came to the new world in search of religious freedom for themselves and for the right to set up a society which reflected their beliefs. They felt about tax-supported religion the way we feel about tax-supported public schools, an absolute necessity to a well-ordered state. The First Amendment was a long way off. The parish churches of New England, both Puritan parish churches and the later Unitarian and Congregational churches, were supported by a tax which everyone paid, whether they went to those churches or not. In New England, therefore, those who were Baptists or Quakers or Universalists, this is a bone of contention between the two groups, not to mention Catholics or Jews, had to pay taxes in support of the churches that they didn't go to. When the unfairness of this was brought to the attention of the Continental Congress in 1774, John Adams, who was a Unitarian, commented that, quote, "One might as well expect a change in the solar system as that the Puritan Commonwealth should abolish its ecclesial laws." That was 1838. 40 years after the Bill of Rights, they finally did so. This church, which leaves you the sovereign right to embrace truth as you see it, which values theological diversity, which sets up no professional intermediary between worshipers and the divine, but instead seeks to provide the tools and knowledge of a good and faithful life, this church is supported only by those who love it and cherish it and want to see it flourish here in Albuquerque, so do fill out those pledge forms. Because that's you and nobody else. This method of church finance would startle the Pilgrims, who are our spiritual parents, but in truth, it's only the logical outcome of their own experiment in religious individualism. Let us give thanks for those intrepid ancestors and the values they launched so thoroughly into our society and into our church.